In May 1947, an 84-year-old man left a castle in California for the last time. His health was failing. His doctors insisted he needed medical care that the remote location could not provide. He had been building the castle for 28 years. It was still not finished. William Randolph Hearst never returned to the hilltop estate he had named La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. He died 4 years later in Beverly Hills, having spent the final years of his life away from the only home that had ever truly mattered to him. The castle he left behind contained 165 rooms, 56 bedrooms, 61 bathrooms, indoor and outdoor swimming pools that were engineering marvels, a private zoo that had once been the largest in the world, 127 acres of gardens and terraces, and an art collection so vast it could have filled 10 museums. Hearst had spent an estimated $50 million building his dream. In today's money, over $900 million. He purchased entire ceilings from European palaces and shipped them to California. He bought so much art and so many antiques that warehouses in New York and San Francisco overflowed with pieces he never even unpacked. The castle was designed by Julia Morgan, the first woman licensed as an architect in California. She worked with Hearst for 28 years, patiently managing his constant changes, his impossible demands, and his insatiable desire for more. More rooms, more beauty, more everything. Hearst shared the castle with Marion Davies, a film actress 34 years younger than him. She was his mistress for over 3 decades. His wife refused to grant him a divorce, so Marion could never be his wife. But she was the hostess of his castle, the center of his world, and eventually the person who saved him financially when his empire collapsed. Today, Hearst Castle is one of California's most visited tourist attractions. Over 1 million people tour it annually. The estate that was built as the most private pleasure palace in America became one of its most public treasures. The castle that Hearst never finished has been preserved exactly as he left it. This is the story of how that castle was built, and why the man who created it could never stop building, even when he ran out of time and money to continue. The boy who toured Europe's castles. William Randolph Hearst was born on April 29, 1863 in San Francisco, California. He was the only child of George Hearst and Phoebe Apperson Hearst. The timing of his birth was fortunate. His father was about to become extraordinarily wealthy. George was a mining engineer with an instinct for finding gold and silver where others saw only rock. He had arrived in California during the gold rush of 1849 with almost nothing. By the time his son was born 14 years later, George owned stakes in some of the richest mines in the American West. The Offer mine in Nevada's Comstock Lode made George his first fortune. The Homestake mine in South Dakota would make him even wealthier. By the time William was 10 years old, his father was a millionaire many times over. In an era when a comfortable middle-class income was $2,000 per year, George's mining interests generated hundreds of thousands annually. Phoebe Apperson was 19 years younger than her husband. She had married George when she was 21 and he was 40. The marriage was pragmatic more than romantic. George was often away at mining sites. Phoebe managed their San Francisco household and raised their son largely alone. But Phoebe had ambitions for William that extended far beyond San Francisco. She wanted him to see the world, to understand art and culture, to have opportunities that neither she nor her husband had experienced growing up. In 1873, when William was 10 years old, Phoebe took him on an 18-month tour of Europe. The trip changed William's life. They traveled through England, France, Germany, and Italy. They visited museums and galleries. They attended operas and concerts. And most importantly for William's future, they toured the grand estates of European nobility, medieval fortresses, Renaissance palaces, country houses where aristocratic families had lived for centuries. William was mesmerized. The scale of these buildings, the beauty of their architecture, the way they announced power and permanence. He later wrote that this journey planted a seed that would grow for the rest of his life. He wanted to build something like what he had seen, something that would last for centuries, something that would make people stop and stare. The palaces William saw were centuries old. They had been built by families with inherited titles and land that stretched back generations. William had no title. His father had started with nothing. But America in the late 19th century offered something the Old World did not: the possibility that wealth alone could buy what aristocracy provided across the Atlantic: position, respect, legacy. William returned to San Francisco changed by what he had seen. He was still a child, but he had developed tastes that would never leave him. He collected things obsessively even as a boy: stamps, coins, books, art prints. His mother encouraged this. She believed that appreciation for beauty was a mark of civilization. George continued expanding his mining interests throughout the 1870s and 80s. By 1886, he had accumulated enough wealth and political connections to be appointed as a United States Senator from California. He was elected to a full term in 1887. William was sent east to preparatory school and then to Harvard University. He was a mediocre student academically, but showed talent for two things: writing and causing trouble. He became business manager of the Harvard Lampoon, the university's humor magazine. He demonstrated an early gift for sensational journalism and promotional stunts. William was expelled from Harvard in his junior year. The exact reasons are disputed, but the most popular story involves him sending chamber pots to his professors, with their names inscribed on the inside. Whether true or apocryphal, the story captures something essential about William's personality. He had no respect for authority and enjoyed shocking people. After Harvard, William returned to San Francisco. His father had purchased a failing newspaper called the San Francisco Examiner in 1880 to settle a gambling debt. George viewed the paper as worthless. William saw it as an opportunity. In 1887, at age 23, William convinced his father to let him take over the Examiner. George reluctantly agreed. He told his son he was wasting his time on something that would never make money. William promised to prove him wrong. William threw himself into newspaper work with manic energy. He hired talented writers. He invested in better printing equipment. He pioneered sensational headlines and lurid stories that grabbed attention. Crime, scandal, corruption, human interest stories told with emotional impact rather than dry facts. The Examiner's circulation exploded. What had been a failing paper became one of San Francisco's most read publications. William had discovered his talent. He was a genius at understanding what people wanted to read and giving them more of it than anyone else dared. George died in 1891. He left William a substantial fortune and the foundation of what would become a media empire. But George did not live to see his son become the most powerful newspaper publisher in America. That transformation would take another decade. William's mother, Phoebe, outlived George by 28 years. She became one of America's most prominent philanthropists, supporting education and women's causes. She remained close to William throughout her life, though she worried about his increasingly sensational journalism and his complicated personal life. But Phoebe had given William something that shaped everything he would later build. She had shown him the grandeur of European estates when he was 10 years old. She had taught him to appreciate beauty and to believe that he deserved to live surrounded by it. That 18-month tour in 1873 planted the dream that would eventually become Hearst Castle. The boy who had stared up at medieval fortresses and Renaissance palaces would spend 28 years and $50 million trying to build his own. He would never quite finish, but he would create something that millions of people would travel to see long after he was gone. Building a media empire. In 1895, William Randolph Hearst moved to New York and purchased the New York Journal. He paid $77,000 for a paper that was losing money and hemorrhaging readers. His friends thought he was making a terrible mistake. New York already had dominant newspapers. What could a young publisher from San Francisco possibly accomplish? Hearst accomplished a revolution. The New York Journal's main competitor was Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. Pulitzer had pioneered sensational journalism in the 1880s, using bold headlines and human interest stories to build circulation. Hearst studied Pulitzer's methods and decided to beat him at his own game. Hearst raided the World's staff, offering salaries that Pulitzer could not match. He hired away some of Pulitzer's best writers and illustrators. Most famously, he hired Richard Outcault, creator of The Yellow Kid, a popular comic strip that had been running in the world. The competition over Outcault and his comic gave rise to the term yellow journalism. But Hearst did more than steal talent. He pushed sensationalism to extremes that made even Pulitzer uncomfortable. The journal ran massive headlines. Stories were written to provoke emotional reactions rather than inform. Crime was covered in lurid detail. Scandals were exaggerated or invented when reality proved insufficient. The circulation war between the journal and the world became legendary. Each paper tried to outdo the other with increasingly outrageous coverage. The competition benefited both newspapers initially, as New Yorkers bought papers from both publishers to see which would go further. Hearst's willingness to exaggerate facts and manipulate emotions for circulation had consequences that extended beyond newspaper sales. In 1898, the battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors. The cause was unclear. An accident seemed likely, but accidents did not sell newspapers. The journal ran screaming headlines blaming Spain for the explosion. The warship Maine was split in two by an enemy's secret infernal machine, the journal declared, despite having zero evidence. Hearst's coverage helped push the United States toward war with Spain. The Spanish-American War of 1898 lasted 4 months and resulted in American acquisition of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Whether Hearst actually said, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war," is disputed by historians. The quote was attributed to him decades later, and he denied ever saying it. But whether or not he spoke those exact words, the sentiment captured his approach. News was not something to report objectively. News was something to create, shape, and sell. The Spanish-American War made Hearst's reputation as a powerful media figure. It also made him wealthy beyond even his father's mining fortune. By 1900, the New York Journal had the highest circulation of any American newspaper. Hearst was generating profits that allowed him to expand aggressively. Over the next 2 decades, Hearst built a media empire that dwarfed anything that had existed before. He purchased newspapers in Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and other major cities. At his peak, Hearst owned 28 daily newspapers. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans got their news from a Hearst paper. But newspapers were only the beginning. Hearst expanded into magazines, buying or founding titles that included Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, and Harper's Bazaar. He invested in newsreels, the short films shown in movie theaters before features. He understood that media was changing, and that whoever controlled multiple platforms would control public opinion. Hearst's influence extended into politics. He served 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1903 to 1907. He ran unsuccessfully for mayor of New York City and for governor of New York. His political career was undistinguished, but it demonstrated his ambitions extended beyond business. He wanted power in all its forms. His newspapers promoted Hearst's political views relentlessly. He opposed American entry into World War I until public opinion made that position untenable. He criticized big business when it served his purposes, despite being one of the wealthiest men in America himself. He used his papers to attack enemies and promote allies. Objectivity was never the goal. By 1910, William Randolph Hearst was one of the most powerful men in America. His newspapers reached tens of millions of readers. His political influence was substantial. His personal fortune was estimated at between $30 and $50 million, equivalent to roughly $1 billion today. But Hearst's personal life was becoming complicated in ways that would shape everything he built, including the castle that would become his most famous creation. In 1903, Hearst married Millicent Wilson, a dancer and singer he had met in New York. Millicent was beautiful, socially ambitious, and willing to marry a man whose reputation was already controversial. They had 5 sons together over the next dozen years: George, William Randolph Jr., John, and twins Randolph and David. The marriage was conventional on the surface. Hearst and Millicent appeared together at social events. She managed their New York household and raised their sons. They maintained estates on both coasts. From the outside, they looked like a successful, wealthy couple. But the marriage was hollow emotionally. Hearst and Millicent had little in common beyond their children. She wanted social respectability. He wanted freedom to pursue his ambitions without constraint. The arrangement worked as long as both stayed in their prescribed roles. In 1916, everything changed. Hearst met Marion Davies. Marion was a 19-year-old chorus girl performing in the Ziegfeld Follies on Broadway. Hearst was 53, married with 5 children, and one of the most recognizable men in America. The age difference was scandalous. The fact that he was married made the relationship impossible in conventional terms. Hearst did not care about convention. He wanted Marion. And he had the wealth and power to pursue what he wanted regardless of social consequences. Over the next 3 decades, Marion Davies would become the center of Hearst's life. She would live with him in estates across America. She would be the hostess of his castle in California. She would manage his social life and eventually save him financially when his empire collapsed. But she would never be his wife, because Millicent refused to grant Hearst a divorce. The relationship with Marion shaped everything Hearst built after 1916. The castle he would create in California was not built for Millicent. It was built for Marion. The parties he threw were for Marion to host. The Hollywood celebrities who visited came to see Marion, who was by then a film actress managed and promoted by Hearst's own studio. William Randolph Hearst built a media empire that gave him power over public opinion, political influence, and immense wealth. But all of that power could not give him the one thing he wanted most: the ability to marry the woman he loved. So instead, he built her a castle. The Chorus Girl and the Married Mogul. Marion Cecilia Duras was born on January 3, 1897, in Brooklyn, New York. She was the youngest of 5 children born to Bernard Duras, a lawyer and judge, and Rose Riley. The family was middle class, connected, but not wealthy. Marion grew up near Prospect Park, in a neighborhood where ambition mattered more than inheritance. Marion had 3 older sisters, who all went into show business. They changed their surname from Duras to Davies after spotting the name on a real estate sign in their neighborhood. The new name sounded more theatrical, more American, more likely to succeed on Broadway. Marion followed her sisters into entertainment while still a teenager. She attended a convent school but left early. Marion had a stutter that made academic work difficult and public speaking painful, but the stutter disappeared when she sang or performed. On stage, she was confident and charming. Off stage, she struggled with the speech impediment her entire life. Performing became not just a career, but a refuge. By 1915, Marion was dancing in Broadway choruses. She was beautiful in the specific way that chorus girls needed to be: blonde, blue-eyed, with features that photographed well under stage lights. She was not the most talented dancer or the strongest singer, but she had something more valuable: presence. When Marion was on stage, people watched her. In 1916, at age 19, Marion was cast in the Ziegfeld Follies. The Follies were the most prestigious theatrical revue in America, a showcase for beautiful women performing elaborate musical numbers. Being selected for the Follies meant Marion had arrived in New York entertainment. It also meant she attracted attention from wealthy men who attended performances specifically to see young women like her. William Randolph Hearst sat in the front row. Hearst was 53 years old when he first saw Marion perform. He had been married to Millicent for 13 years. They had 5 sons, the youngest only 2 years old. His newspapers were attacking political enemies and promoting his views to millions of readers daily. He was one of the most powerful men in America, and he became obsessed with a 19-year-old chorus girl. Marion later recalled that Hearst attended the Follies every night for 8 weeks. He always sat in the front row. He sent flowers and gifts to Marion and other girls in the cast: small silver boxes, gloves, candy. Marion was terrified of him initially. The other dancers warned her, "He's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Look out for him." Hearst never approached Marion directly at first. Instead, he arranged for a photographer to invite her to a studio for a portrait session. The photographer worked for Hearst, though Marion did not know that. She was photographed in elaborate costumes, a Japanese geisha, a virginal bride. The photos were exquisite. They appeared in Hearst publications. Marion's face became familiar to readers before she knew why. The courtship, if it can be called that, was calculated and manipulative. Hearst had resources that a teenage chorus girl could not resist. He offered her a film career. He promised to make her a star. He provided money that her family needed. And eventually he offered something more dangerous. Love, or at least the appearance of it. By 1917, Marion and Hearst were involved romantically. She was 20. He was 54. The relationship was not secret exactly, but it was not acknowledged publicly either. Hearst was still married. Millicent lived in New York with their sons. Marion lived separately but saw Hearst constantly. In 1918, Hearst founded Cosmopolitan Pictures specifically to produce films starring Marion Davies. She signed an exclusive contract at $500 per week, an enormous salary for a young actress with minimal film experience. The contract effectively made Marion Hearst's property. He controlled what films she made, how she was promoted, and what her public image would be. Marion's first film for Cosmopolitan was Cecilia of the Pink Roses in 1918. It was not successful critically or commercially. Marion's acting was stiff. Her beauty translated to film, but her personality did not. She needed practice and better direction. Hearst was undeterred. He had purchased newspapers to promote his political views. He would use them to promote Marion's career. Hearst's newspapers gave Marion's films publicity that other actresses could only dream of. Reviews were always positive, regardless of the film's actual quality. Photos of Marion appeared constantly in Hearst publications. Readers across America saw her face so frequently that many assumed she was already a major star. The publicity created the reality. By the early 1920s, Marion Davies was famous because Hearst newspapers said she was. But there was a problem with Hearst's management of Marion's career. He was a Victorian man controlling a modern woman's image. Hearst insisted that Marion only play virtuous, innocent characters, romantic comedies, historical dramas, nothing that suggested she was the kind of woman who would live openly as a married man's mistress. Marion was actually gifted at comedy. She was naturally funny, with excellent timing for physical humor and a talent for impersonation. She could mimic other actresses and celebrities flawlessly. At parties, she entertained guests with dead-on impressions. But Hearst rarely let her make comedies. He wanted her to be taken seriously, to be respectable on screen even if their relationship off-screen violated every convention of respectability. The few comedic films Marion made were her best work. Show People, in 1928, showcased her real talents. Critics praised her performance. But Hearst's insistence on controlling her image limited how good her career could actually become. He was building a showcase for Marion that constrained rather than liberated her abilities. The relationship between Marion and Millicent Hearst existed in a strange parallel structure. Millicent remained Hearst's legal wife. She lived in their New York mansion on Riverside Drive. She raised their 5 sons. She appeared at social functions where being Mrs. William Randolph Hearst mattered. She received an allowance that allowed her to live luxuriously. And she absolutely refused to grant Hearst a divorce. Hearst reportedly offered Millicent financial settlements that would have made her independently wealthy. She declined. Being Mrs. Hearst gave her social position that money alone could not buy. Her sons would inherit the Hearst name and fortune, regardless of what their father did with his mistress. Millicent had no incentive to cooperate with a divorce that would only benefit Marion. So the arrangement continued. Millicent in New York, Marion wherever Hearst was. The situation was widely known and reported in newspapers not owned by Hearst. Competitors gleefully covered the scandal. But Hearst's own newspapers never acknowledged that Marion was anything other than an actress he admired professionally. Marion lived with this ambiguity for over 3 decades. She later told friends she would have given everything to marry Hearst, not for the money or security. He had already provided more than she could spend in a lifetime. She wanted the legitimacy that marriage would provide. She wanted to be Mrs. Hearst, not Mr. Hearst's companion. It never happened. Millicent held firm. Marian remained the mistress. And Hearst, who controlled newspapers and politicians and could shape public opinion on almost any subject, could not control the one thing that would have made Marian completely his. Marian accepted the situation because she genuinely loved Hearst, despite everything. The age difference, the impossibility of marriage, the control he exercised over her career. Friends who knew her well believed the relationship was real, not transactional. Marian gave up opportunities in Hollywood because Hearst wanted her available. She structured her life around his needs and schedule. She stayed with him through financial disasters and public humiliation. In 1928, Marian was at the peak of her film career. She was 31 years old, beautiful, talented in ways Hearst rarely allowed her to demonstrate, and famous largely because of his promotion. She would make dozens more films over the next decade, but her career would always be overshadowed by her relationship with the man who made it possible and simultaneously limited what it could become. Marian Davies was more than William Randolph Hearst's mistress. She was his hostess, his companion, his financial savior, and eventually, the person who stayed with him until he drew his last breath. But she would never be his wife. And that fact shaped everything about how they lived, including the castle they would share for 20 years. The castle was being built for Marian as much as for Hearst. A place where she could be hostess without the social complications that defined their life everywhere else. A private kingdom where the rules were theirs to make. A paradise where being Mrs. Hearst did not matter because Marian would reign regardless of her legal status. Hearst began planning that castle in 1919. The same year his mother died, and he finally inherited the land where his dream would be built. 1919, inheriting the ranch. Phoebe Apperson Hearst died on April 13, 1919, during the influenza epidemic that killed millions worldwide. She was 76 years old. Her death devastated William Randolph Hearst, who had remained close to his mother throughout his life, despite her concerns about his journalism and his relationship with Marian Davies. Phoebe left William an inheritance that changed everything. $11 million in cash and securities, and 250,000 acres of California ranch land along the central coast near the village of San Simeon. $11 million in 1919 is equivalent to roughly $180 million today. It was an enormous sum, though William had already accumulated substantial wealth through his newspapers. The money was less important than the land. The San Simeon Ranch had been purchased by William's father, George Hearst, beginning in 1865. George had bought the original 40,000 acres and continued acquiring adjacent properties for decades. By the time of his death in 1891, the Hearst Ranch encompassed vast stretches of coastal California between San Francisco and Los Angeles. The land was remote and undeveloped. No electricity, no paved roads, no structures except ranch buildings used by the workers who managed the cattle operation. But the land had something more valuable than modern amenities. It had a hill with views that stretched for miles in every direction, ocean to the west, mountains to the east, sky that seemed infinite. George and Phoebe Hearst had used the San Simeon property for family camping trips when William was a boy. They called the spot Camp Hill. Ranch hands would pitch large canvas tents with wood floors and furnish them with beds, rugs, and comfortable chairs. Professional cooks prepared meals. The family would spend weeks at Camp Hill, riding horses through the canyons during the day and sleeping under stars at night. William had loved Camp Hill as a child. The isolation from San Francisco, the sense of owning land as far as you could see, the feeling that this place belonged to the Hearst family in ways that city properties never could. When he inherited the ranch in 1919, William was 56 years old. He had been thinking about what to build there for decades. Immediately after Phoebe's death, William wrote to an architect he had worked with previously. Julia Morgan was based in San Francisco and had designed several buildings for Phoebe, including work on the Hearst Ranch property. William knew her reputation for quality work and her willingness to deal with demanding clients. The letter William sent Julia Morgan in 1919 has become famous. I would like to build a little something up on the hill at San Simeon. I get tired of going up there and camping in tents. I'm getting a little old for that. I'd like to get something that would be more comfortable. A little something. More comfortable. The understatement was either genuine modesty or deliberate misdirection. What William Randolph Hearst actually wanted was a castle that would rival anything he had seen in Europe as a 10-year-old boy. He wanted to recreate the grandeur that had fascinated him on that 18-month tour with his mother in 1873. Julia Morgan traveled to San Simeon to assess the site. She climbed Camp Hill and stood where William envisioned his house. The location was spectacular, but challenging. The hill rose 1,600 feet above sea level. Building materials would need to be transported up rough roads. Water would need to be brought from distant sources. Construction would be exposed to coastal weather, fog, and wind. Morgan was not intimidated by the challenges. She was an engineer as well as an architect. She had pioneered the use of reinforced concrete in seismic zones after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. She knew how to build structures that would last in difficult conditions. Morgan and Hearst began planning what would officially be called La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. Hearst usually just called it the Ranch. But everyone else would call it Hearst Castle, even though Hearst himself disliked that name. The initial plan was modest only by comparison to what eventually emerged. Morgan proposed a main building with 3 guest houses arranged around it. The main building would contain Hearst's private rooms and public spaces for entertaining. The guest houses would accommodate visitors. Gardens and terraces would connect the buildings. The style would be Mediterranean Revival, inspired by the Spanish missions that dotted California and the European architecture Hearst had admired as a child. Hearst approved the concept but immediately began expanding it. Could the main building be larger? Could there be more guest houses? Could they build pools? What about a zoo? Morgan patiently revised her plans as Hearst's vision grew more ambitious. By late 1919, construction plans were nearly complete. Morgan had hired contractors and assembled workers. Materials were being ordered. The project that Hearst described as a little something was already shaping up to be one of the largest private construction projects in California history. William Randolph Hearst was 56 years old. He had wealth, power, newspapers that reached millions, and a mistress who loved him despite the impossibility of their situation. He had inherited the land his father had assembled over decades. And he had the architect who could transform his childhood dreams into reality. What Hearst did not have was patience. He wanted to see his castle finished. He wanted to live in it with Marion. He wanted to entertain there and show the world what he had built. He was not a young man anymore. Time felt urgent. Morgan warned him that construction would take years. The site was remote. The buildings would be complex. The scale was enormous. Hearst acknowledged her concerns but pushed for the work to proceed as quickly as possible. Construction began in 1920. William Randolph Hearst would spend the next 28 years building his castle. He would never finish it, but he would create something that 1 million people a year still visit, almost a century later. The dream that began when a 10-year-old boy toured European castles with his mother was about to become reality. Or at least as close to reality as 28 years and $50 million could make it. Julia Morgan, the architect nobody knew. Julia Morgan was born on January 20th, 1872 in San Francisco. She was the second child of Charles Bill Morgan and Eliza Parmalee Morgan. Her father was a businessman whose ventures rarely succeeded. Her mother was the pragmatic force who held the family together financially and emotionally when Charles's schemes collapsed. Julia exhibited talent for mathematics from childhood. She was precise, detail-oriented, and comfortable with technical subjects that intimidated most girls of her era. Her family encouraged her education in ways that were unusual for the 1870s and 80s. They believed intelligence should be developed regardless of gender. After graduating from Oakland High School in 1890, Julia enrolled at the University of California at Berkeley. She chose to study civil engineering. The decision was radical. Engineering was considered entirely inappropriate for women. Physical work, construction sites, male-dominated professions where a woman's presence would be unwelcome at best. Julia was the only woman in Berkeley's engineering program. She graduated in 1894 with a degree in civil engineering. Her classmates had treated her with mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Her professors recognized her abilities, but doubted she would find work in her field. While at Berkeley, Julia had taken architecture courses and developed a passion for building design. One of her instructors was Bernard Maybeck, an architect who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Maybeck recognized Julia's exceptional talent and encouraged her to pursue architecture formally. The École des Beaux-Arts was the most prestigious architecture school in the world. Located in Paris, it trained the architects who designed Europe's grandest buildings. The school had never admitted a woman. Maybeck told Julia she should be the first. In 1896, Julia traveled to Paris and applied to the École. The school refused her application, not because she was unqualified, because she was female. The École's regulations did not explicitly forbid women, but the administration had never considered the possibility of admitting one. Julia waited in Paris for 2 years while the École debated what to do about her application. She studied French. She took courses at other institutions. She prepared architectural drawings to demonstrate her abilities, and she refused to leave until the École made a decision. In 1898, the École des Beaux-Arts admitted Julia Morgan to its architecture program. She was the first woman ever accepted. The school's decision was grudging, not celebratory. Julia was tolerated rather than welcomed, but she was admitted, and that was sufficient. Julia spent the next 4 years in Paris studying architecture. The Beaux-Arts curriculum was rigorous and competitive. Students worked in ateliers, design studios led by master architects. Projects were judged in open competitions. Public criticism was harsh. Students who could not handle the pressure dropped out. Julia thrived. Her engineering background gave her technical knowledge that many architecture students lacked. She understood structures, materials, and the mathematics that made buildings stand. Her designs were practical as well as beautiful. She graduated with a certificate in architecture in 1902, the first woman to complete the École's program. Returning to San Francisco, Julia faced the problem that her Berkeley professors had predicted. Who would hire a female architect? Construction was a male world. Contractors did not want to take orders from women. Clients assumed women could not understand the technical requirements of serious buildings. Julia was fortunate that one person believed in her abilities. Phoebe Apperson Hearst, William Randolph Hearst's mother, had met Julia in Paris during her studies. Phoebe was impressed by Julia's intelligence and determination. When Julia returned to California, Phoebe hired her for several projects. Julia worked for architect John Galen Howard for several years, contributing to the master plan for the University of California campus. Howard paid her almost nothing, telling colleagues he could hire her cheaply, as it is a woman. Julia accepted the low salary because she needed experience and professional connections more than money. In 1904, Julia Morgan became the first woman licensed as an architect in California. She opened her own office in San Francisco, working from a small space where staff knew her as J.M. She deliberately avoided emphasizing her gender in professional contexts, knowing that many potential clients would dismiss a female architect without seeing her work. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire changed Julia's career trajectory. Most of the city was destroyed. Buildings collapsed or burned. Architects and engineers were desperately needed to rebuild. Julia's work during the reconstruction established her reputation. 2 of Julia's buildings survived the earthquake with minimal damage. The bell tower and library at Mills College in Oakland remained structurally sound while buildings around them failed. The survival was not accidental. Julia had pioneered the use of reinforced concrete in ways that provided superior earthquake resistance. When both Mills College buildings survived intact, Julia Morgan was catapulted into the upper ranks of Bay Area architects. Suddenly, being a woman was less important than being the architect whose buildings did not collapse during earthquakes. Clients who would have dismissed her before the earthquake now sought her out. Julia's practice grew rapidly after 1906. She designed homes for wealthy families in the Berkeley and Oakland Hills. She designed buildings for the Young Women's Christian Association, beginning a professional relationship with the YWCA that would last decades. She designed churches, schools, commercial buildings, and institutional structures. Phoebe Hearst remained one of Julia's most important clients. Phoebe commissioned Julia to remodel her Pleasanton estate, Hacienda del Pozo de Verona. The work brought Julia into closer contact with the Hearst family and demonstrated her ability to handle large, complex residential projects. In 1913, Phoebe recommended Julia to design the Asilomar Conference Grounds in Pacific Grove near Monterey. The project was for the YWCA and required multiple buildings arranged across over 100 acres of coastal property. Julia designed structures that blended with the natural landscape, using local materials and arts and crafts styling that emphasized simplicity and functionality. Asilomar established Julia's reputation for designing buildings that worked, not just architecturally, but practically. Her structures were beautiful, but also livable. Rooms were shaped for specific activities. Circulation made sense. Details were carefully considered. Julia designed from the inside out, thinking about how people would actually use spaces rather than imposing grand concepts that looked impressive in drawings but failed in reality. By 1919, Julia Morgan had designed hundreds of buildings. She employed a staff of architects and draftsmen in her San Francisco office on the 13th floor of the Merchants Exchange building. Her practice was successful and her reputation was secure. She was 47 years old, unmarried, and completely devoted to her work. When William Randolph Hearst contacted Julia about building a little something at San Simeon, she had no illusions about what the project would require. Hearst was demanding, changeable, and had unlimited ambitions. The site was remote and challenging. The work would consume years. Julia accepted the commission anyway, partly because the Hearst family had supported her career from the beginning, partly because the challenge interested her, and partly because building a castle on a hilltop overlooking the Pacific Ocean was the kind of project that came once in an architect's lifetime. Julia Morgan would work on Hearst Castle for 28 years. The project would become the most famous work of her career, overshadowing everything else she designed. It would consume enormous amounts of her time and test her patience repeatedly. And it would remain unfinished when Hearst finally left in 1947. But in 1919, Julia could not know any of that. She only knew that William Randolph Hearst wanted to build something extraordinary. And she was the architect who could make his dreams real. 1919 to 1925, building begins. Construction at San Simeon began in 1920. The first task was building a road that could support heavy trucks carrying materials up the hill. The existing ranch roads were dirt tracks suitable for horses, but useless for construction equipment. Julia Morgan designed a road that wound up the hillside in a series of switchbacks, gaining elevation gradually enough that loaded trucks could make the climb. Water was the second critical problem. Camp Hill had no natural water source. Morgan arranged for pipes to bring water from mountain springs miles away. The water system had to provide enough supply not just for construction, but for the eventual estate, including gardens, pools, and dozens of residents and guests. Electricity came from diesel generators initially. The remote location made connection to power grids impossible. Morgan planned for a permanent electrical system that could support the castle's needs, but the generators would have to suffice during construction. Morgan established construction offices at the base of the hill in the village of San Simeon. She hired a resident engineer, Camille Rossi, to supervise daily work. Morgan herself traveled from San Francisco to San Simeon frequently, making the journey by train and then automobile over rough roads. The trip took most of a day each direction. Hearst visited the site constantly during construction. He arrived with Marion Davies, often bringing guests to show them what was being built. Hearst would walk the site with Morgan, suggesting changes, adding features, reconsidering decisions made weeks earlier. Morgan learned to be patient with his constant revisions. The first buildings constructed were the three guest houses, Casa del Mar, Casa del Monte, and Casa del Sol. The Spanish names reflected the Mediterranean revival style Morgan had designed. Each guest house was a complete residence with bedrooms, bathrooms, sitting rooms, and private terraces. Casa del Mar, House of the Sea, faced west toward the ocean. Its terraces provided views of the Pacific and captured cooling breezes during hot summer months. The building's design incorporated Spanish colonial elements with Moorish details. Tile work, wrought iron, and carved wood created interiors that felt transported from Europe. Casa del Monte, House of the Mountain, sat higher on the hill and faced east toward the Santa Lucia Mountains. The positioning gave guests sunrise views and protection from coastal fog. Morgan designed Casa del Monte with slightly different architectural details than Casa del Mar, ensuring each guest house had distinct character. Casa del Sol, House of the Sun, completed the triangle of guest houses. Its position captured southern exposure, making it warm even during winter months. The interior featured tiles Morgan had designed herself, produced by California Faience, a tile company she worked with frequently. The three guest houses were completed by 1922. Hearst and Marion moved into Casa del Mar, while work continued on the main building. They began entertaining guests almost immediately, even with construction ongoing around them. Hearst wanted to use his castle, not wait years for completion before occupying it. The main building, Casa Grande, presented far greater challenges than the guest houses. Morgan designed it as a massive structure rising 6 stories if you counted basement levels. The building would contain over 100 rooms. Its footprint covered over 60,000 square feet. The scale required engineering beyond typical residential construction. Morgan used reinforced concrete throughout Casa Grande. The material provided earthquake resistance and allowed for the large open spaces Hearst wanted. Concrete was less expensive than traditional masonry, but required skilled formwork and careful pouring. Morgan supervised the concrete work personally during her site visits. The architectural style of Casa Grande was Spanish Revival with Gothic and Mediterranean influences. Morgan drew inspiration from Spanish churches, particularly the Cathedral of Seville. The facade featured twin bell towers that would become the castle's most recognizable feature. The towers were not merely decorative. They housed bells that Hearst collected and water tanks that supplied the estate. Construction proceeded floor by floor. Workers completed the basement levels first, installing mechanical systems, storage rooms, and wine cellars. The ground floor followed, with grand public rooms for entertaining. Upper floors contained bedrooms and private spaces. Hearst changed the plans constantly. Morgan would complete working drawings for a room, and Hearst would decide he wanted something different. Larger windows, different ceiling height. A fireplace moved to the opposite wall. Each change required new drawings and modified construction. Morgan employed a patience that bordered on saintly. She would revise drawings without complaint, explaining to contractors how to modify work already underway. She understood that Hearst's changes came from genuine desire to improve the buildings, not capriciousness. He was building his dream, and dreams evolve. By 1925, Casa Grande's exterior was largely complete. The twin bell towers rose 165 feet above the hilltop, visible for miles. The limestone facade gleamed white in California sunlight. The building's scale dominated the landscape while its proportions prevented it from appearing crude or oversized. The interior work continued. Hearst was installing antiques and architectural elements purchased in Europe. Entire ceilings were shipped from Spanish and Italian buildings, dismantled, transported to California, and reinstalled at San Simeon. Fireplaces came from French chateaux. Doors were salvaged from monasteries. Hearst was not just furnishing his castle. He was filling it with fragments of European history. Morgan coordinated the installation of these elements, adapting her designs to accommodate pieces that Hearst purchased impulsively. A 15th century Spanish convent entrance became Casa Grande's front door. The carved stone and iron grillwork were beautiful, but required structural modifications to support their weight. The collaboration between Morgan and Hearst functioned despite their very different approaches. Morgan was methodical, practical, and committed to structural integrity. Hearst was impulsive, aesthetic, and unconcerned with practical limits. Somehow they produced buildings that satisfied both sensibilities. Workers on the site numbered in the hundreds during peak construction periods. Carpenters, stonemasons, plasterers, tile setters, electricians, plumbers. Many were Italian immigrants with skills learned in Europe. They carved stone, laid tile, and created plasterwork with techniques rarely used in American construction. The cost of construction was enormous and growing constantly. Hearst never told Morgan to limit expenses. He wanted quality regardless of price. If materials were not available in California, Morgan imported them from Europe or Mexico. If craftsmen with necessary skills could not be found locally, she brought them from elsewhere. By late 1925, the castle was becoming recognizable as the estate Hearst had envisioned. Casa Grande towered over the 3 guest houses. Gardens were being planted on terraces carved into the hillside. The first swimming pool was under construction, and Hearst was already planning expansions that would consume another 2 decades. The boy who had toured European castles at age 10 was now 62 years old. His castle was rising on the California hillside. It was far from finished. It would never be finished. But it was becoming real, stone by stone, room by room, dream by dream. Neptune Pool and Roman Pool. The outdoor swimming pool at Hearst Castle is called the Neptune Pool. The name comes from the 17th century marble statues of Neptune and Nereids that overlook the water. But the name understates what the pool actually is. It is one of the most spectacular private swimming pools ever constructed. The Neptune Pool sits on a terrace carved into the hillside below Casa Grande. The pool is 104 feet long and 95 feet at its widest point. The depth ranges from 3 to 10 feet. The pool holds 345,000 gallons of water. These numbers make it large, but not exceptional. What makes the Neptune Pool extraordinary is everything surrounding the water. The pool is framed by a white marble colonnade. The columns are copies of Roman and Greek originals, cast in concrete and finished to look like carved stone. Behind the colonnade, a covered walkway provides shade for guests who prefer to watch swimmers rather than join them. The walkway's ceiling is decorated with painted tiles in blue and gold. At the far end of the pool, a temple facade rises behind the water. The facade is copied from a Roman temple, with pediment and columns creating a backdrop that makes the pool feel like an ancient bath transported to California. 4 Italian marble relief sculptures decorate the sides of the colonnade, depicting classical scenes. The Neptune statue and his attendant Nereids are positioned at the temple end of the pool. The sculptures are authentic 17th century works purchased by Hearst in Europe. Neptune holds his trident, commanding the water. The Nereids surround him, frozen in marble forever. The engineering required to build the Neptune Pool was substantial. The pool was built and rebuilt 3 times between 1924 and 1936. Each version was larger and more elaborate than the previous. Hearst kept changing what he wanted. Morgan kept redesigning. The first Neptune Pool was completed in 1924. It was modest by later standards, without the colonnade or temple facade. Hearst used it for several years, then decided it was insufficient. He wanted something grander. The second version, completed in 1928, added the colonnade and increased the pool's size. But Hearst still was not satisfied. He wanted the pool longer, the colonnade more elaborate, the whole composition more impressive. The final version, completed in 1936, is what visitors see today. Morgan had spent 12 years designing and building swimming pools for Hearst. The Neptune Pool had consumed more time and money than some entire estates, but it achieved what Hearst wanted, a pool that looked like it belonged to Roman emperors rather than American millionaires. The Neptune Pool was not just for swimming. It was a stage for parties. Hearst and Marion hosted hundreds of guests at poolside gatherings during the 1920s and 30s. Hollywood celebrities swam in the Neptune pool: Charlie Chaplin, Cary Grant, Clark Gable, Jean Harlow. The pool appeared in photographs published in newspapers and magazines worldwide. It became as famous as the castle itself. Charles Moore, an architectural historian, called the Neptune pool a grand liquid ballroom. The description captured how the pool functioned. It was less about swimming and more about spectacle. Guests wore bathing suits that were essentially costumes. Swimming was secondary to being seen. The changing rooms adjacent to the pool were decorated as luxuriously as the bedrooms in Casa Grande. Marble floors, carved wood doors, tile work. Each changing room had showers, toilets, and mirrors. Guests could spend hours at the pool without returning to the main buildings. Heating the Neptune pool required a massive boiler system. Even in California, outdoor swimming pools are cold without heating. Hearst insisted the water be warm enough for comfortable swimming year-round. The heating system consumed enormous amounts of energy and required constant maintenance. While the Neptune pool was being built outdoors, Morgan was designing an even more spectacular pool inside Casa Grande. The Roman pool is located in the basement level of the main building. It is entirely enclosed, protected from weather, and visible only to those who descend the stairs from the upper floors. The Roman pool is smaller than the Neptune pool, 81 feet long and 40 feet wide. But what it lacks in size, it exceeds in decoration. Every surface is covered in blue and gold glass mosaic tiles. Over 1 million tiles in total. The tiles create patterns inspired by ancient Roman baths, with geometric designs and images of sea creatures. The pool is lined with tiles from floor to ceiling. The walls shimmer with reflected light from the water. 8 marble statues of Roman gods, goddesses, and heroes stand in niches around the pool. The statues are copies of classical originals, selected by Hearst to create the impression of an ancient bath rediscovered. The ceiling is vaulted, with tiles creating a sky effect overhead. Blue tiles suggest water or sky. Gold tiles provide accents that catch light. The entire room glows with color that changes as water moves and light shifts. The Roman pool's tile work was produced by multiple companies over several years. Morgan designed the patterns and selected colors. Tile makers created individual pieces to her specifications. Workers installed tiles one by one, following Morgan's designs exactly. The precision required was extraordinary. Patterns had to align perfectly across curved surfaces and corners. Lighting the Roman pool presented technical challenges. Morgan installed underwater lights that illuminated the tiles from below. Additional lights hidden in the vaulted ceiling provided overall illumination. The lighting system created effects that made the pool appear to glow from within. Both pools required filtering systems to keep water clean. The Neptune pool's filters were hidden in buildings near the pool. The Roman pool's equipment was in adjacent basement rooms. Both systems were state-of-the-art for the 1920s, though primitive by modern standards. Maintaining the pools required full-time staff. Water chemistry had to be monitored constantly. Tiles needed cleaning. Equipment needed inspection. During parties, staff worked to ensure everything functioned flawlessly. Guests were not supposed to see the labor that made luxury possible. The pools cost enormous sums. Exact figures are difficult to determine because costs were buried in overall construction budgets. But the Neptune pool alone, built 3 times, likely consumed over $1 million. The Roman pool, with its million handset tiles, cost hundreds of thousands more. Hearst never questioned the expense. The pools were essential to his vision. They provided entertainment for guests. They offered beauty that justified the castle's existence. And they gave him something that few other people in America possessed: swimming pools that looked like they belonged in Roman palaces rather than private homes. Director Stanley Kubrick used the Neptune pool as a location for the film Spartacus in 1959. The pool's Roman aesthetic made it perfect for scenes set in ancient Rome. Over a decade after Hearst left the castle, his pools were still serving as backdrops for Hollywood fantasy. Lady Gaga filmed a music video at the Neptune pool decades later. The pool has appeared in countless photographs and films. It remains one of the most recognizable swimming pools in the world, not because of its size, but because of the vision that created it and the architect who made that vision real through 12 years of patient work. Julia Morgan built two of the most spectacular swimming pools ever created for private use. They were engineering achievements, aesthetic triumphs, and monuments to a client's obsession with perfection. The pools took over a decade to complete and cost more than most people's entire houses. But they achieved exactly what Hearst wanted. Pools that made guests gasp. Pools that looked transported from antiquity. Pools that announced wealth and taste in ways that no amount of money spent on paintings or furniture could match. The Neptune Pool and Roman Pool were not just places to swim, they were statements. William Randolph Hearst could build something that rivaled the baths of Roman emperors, and Julia Morgan was the architect who could make that impossible vision become real. The Golden Age. Hollywood comes to San Simeon. The drive up to Hearst Castle in the late 1920s was designed to amaze guests before they ever entered a building. The road wound up the hillside through 5 miles of ranch property, and along that road, guests encountered animals that did not belong in California. Zebras grazed near the roadside, kangaroos bounded through the grass, camels walked in groups, ostriches ran across the landscape, reindeer, elk, and bison roamed in herds. Guests arriving from Los Angeles by train and then automobile would see these exotic animals and realize they were entering a world governed by different rules than ordinary reality. Hearst had established what became the world's largest private zoo. At its peak, the zoo housed over 300 species of animals and birds. The collection included the largest private collection of exotic animals in America and possibly the world. The animals were not caged in the traditional zoo sense. Hearst purchased thousands of acres specifically to create habitats where animals could roam semi-freely. Fencing kept different species separated and prevented animals from wandering off the property. But within their designated areas, animals lived in conditions closer to natural than captive. Hearst's fascination with exotic animals began in childhood. He had visited zoos during his European tour as a boy. As an adult with unlimited wealth, he decided to create his own. He purchased animals from dealers worldwide. Ships brought giraffes from Africa. Trains transported bears from Alaska. Trucks moved animals from ports to San Simeon. The zoo required enormous staff, veterinarians, animal keepers, workers who prepared food and maintained enclosures. The annual cost of feeding and caring for hundreds of animals was substantial. Hearst never questioned the expense. The zoo was not a business. It was a playground. Marion Davies loved the zoo. She would drive guests through the property in Hearst's collection of automobiles, pointing out animals and telling stories about individual creatures. The zoo was conversation starter and entertainment. It made San Simeon feel like fantasy rather than merely a wealthy man's estate. By the mid-1920s, San Simeon was ready to receive guests on the scale Hearst intended. Casa Grande was largely complete, though interior work continued. The 3 guest houses could accommodate dozens of visitors. The Neptune Pool provided entertainment, and Hearst had built an airfield on the property for guests who flew private planes. The guest list for San Simeon during the 1920s and 30s reads like a directory of American fame. Hollywood stars came constantly. Charlie Chaplin was a frequent guest and close friend of Marion's. Cary Grant swam in the Neptune Pool. Clark Gable and Carole Lombard visited together. Jean Harlow, Dolores Del Rio, Mary Pickford, and Joan Crawford all spent weekends at the castle. Politicians came to San Simeon to court Hearst's support. President Calvin Coolidge visited. Winston Churchill stayed at the castle during his American tours. Hearst's newspapers remained influential, and politicians understood that favorable coverage required maintaining good relations with him. Writers, artists, and celebrities from other fields filled the guest rooms. Charles Lindbergh visited after his transatlantic flight made him the most famous man in America. George Bernard Shaw stayed at San Simeon during his California visit. The castle became a destination where famous people came to see other famous people. Marion Davies served as hostess for all these gatherings. She greeted guests, organized activities, and ensured everyone was entertained. Despite never being Hearst's legal wife, Marian functioned as the castle's mistress. Most guests treated her with the respect typically accorded to a wife, though some of Hearst's sons resented her position. Hearst established rules for his guests that reflected his Victorian sensibilities, despite his own unconventional living arrangement. Unmarried couples could not share rooms. Alcohol was limited to one cocktail before dinner. Breakfast was served late because Hearst woke late. Guests were expected to gather for lunch and dinner, which were formal affairs. The one cocktail rule was specifically aimed at controlling Marian's drinking. Marian had developed a drinking problem that worsened throughout the 1920s and 30s. Hearst tried to limit her alcohol consumption by restricting supply. It did not work. Guests smuggled bottles to their rooms. Marian found ways to drink regardless of Hearst's rules. The drinking became serious enough that Marian would sometimes disappear during parties, too intoxicated to host. Hearst would make excuses for her absence. Guests who knew the truth remained discreet. The fiction that Marian was simply tired or unwell was maintained publicly. Despite these problems, the parties at San Simeon during the Golden Age were legendary. Hearst would organize costume parties with elaborate themes. Guests came dressed as historical figures or characters from literature. The castle's grand rooms provided perfect settings for these events. The assembly room, with its Renaissance tapestries and carved ceiling, could accommodate over 200 people. Dinner in the refectory, Casa Grande's main dining hall, seated up to 40 guests at a single table. The room was decorated with 16th century choir stalls from a Spanish monastery and silk banners that hung from the ceiling. Guests ate from Hearst's collection of antique silver and china, while surrounded by art worth millions. The menu at San Simeon was surprisingly simple despite the formal setting. Hearst preferred American comfort food, hamburgers, hot dogs, fried chicken. The disconnect between the Renaissance surroundings and the menu became a running joke among guests. You ate like you were at a roadside diner while sitting in a room that looked like a medieval castle. After dinner, guests gathered in the theater for movie screenings. Hearst had built a private theater that seated 50 people. He received films before general release because of his Hollywood connections and Marian's career. Guests watched movies that would not premiere publicly for weeks or months. Marian often appeared on screen in her own films, creating the surreal experience of watching her act while she sat nearby watching herself. Hearst controlled the guest experience completely. He decided who was invited. He established the schedule. He determined what activities were available. Guests had freedom within boundaries he set, but the boundaries were real. This was Hearst's kingdom, and he was absolutely its ruler. Some guests found the control oppressive. Writers who visited described feeling trapped by the schedule and rules, but most guests adapted happily. Being invited to San Simeon was a privilege. Complaining about your host's eccentricities seemed ungrateful when you were staying in a castle overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The Golden Age of San Simeon lasted roughly from 1925 to 1937, 12 years when the castle functioned as Hearst intended, a gathering place for the famous and powerful, a showcase for Hearst's art collection and architectural vision, a stage where Marian could shine as hostess despite never having the legal status of wife. The depression that began in 1929 did not immediately affect life at San Simeon. Hearst's newspapers continued generating revenue. His wealth seemed secure. The parties continued. The guests still came. The illusion of permanence remained intact, but the Golden Age was ending, though Hearst did not yet realize it. The depression would eventually devastate his finances. Marian's drinking would worsen. Hearst's health would begin declining, and a movie about a newspaper tycoon would destroy Marian's reputation and cast a shadow over everything they had built together. But in the late 1920s, none of that had happened yet. Zebras still roamed the hillsides. Hollywood stars still swam in the Neptune pool. And William Randolph Hearst still believed his castle would stand forever as a monument to his success. The dream seemed real. The dream seemed permanent. The dream seemed complete. It was none of those things. But for a brief golden moment, it was magnificent. 165 rooms of obsession. Casa Grande contained 115 rooms when construction was substantially complete in the late 1920s. The number varied slightly depending on how rooms were counted. Were closets included? Bathrooms? Service spaces? But 115 was the commonly accepted figure for the main building alone. Adding the 3 guest houses brought the total to 165 rooms across the entire hilltop estate. The number became shorthand for the castle's scale, though it failed to capture what those rooms actually contained. The assembly room was the heart of Casa Grande. This was where guests gathered before dinner and after movie screenings. The room was designed to impress immediately and continuously. 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a ceiling height of over 20 feet. The scale was grand, but not overwhelming. Julia Morgan had calculated proportions that made the room feel impressive without being cavernous. The ceiling was the room's most spectacular feature. Carved and gilded wood panels from a 15th century Italian palazzo. Hearst had acquired the entire ceiling, had it dismantled in Italy, shipped to California, and reinstalled at San Simeon. The panels depicted religious and mythological scenes in intricate detail. Gold leaf caught light from chandeliers and made the ceiling appear to glow. The walls were covered with 16th century Flemish tapestries depicting scenes from the life of Daniel. The tapestries had been woven for a noble family and hung in a castle for centuries before Hearst acquired them. They provided color, texture, and helped absorb sound in the large room. Without the tapestries, voices would have echoed uncomfortably. 2 massive fireplaces occupied opposite ends of the assembly room. The mantels were carved limestone, Renaissance period, salvaged from French chateaux. During winter months, fires burned in both fireplaces simultaneously. The room was so large that both fires were needed to provide adequate heating. The furniture in the assembly room was a mixture of Spanish, Italian, and French antiques from the 16th through 18th centuries. Hearst acquired pieces impulsively during buying trips abroad or through dealers who shipped catalogs to San Simeon. Many pieces were museum quality, some were merely expensive. He collected compulsively without consistent criteria beyond "I want that." One corner of the assembly room featured a hidden door in the wood paneling next to a fireplace. The door opened to reveal a private elevator that connected to Hearst's Gothic suite on the 3rd floor. He enjoyed surprising guests by appearing suddenly through the hidden door, entering rooms unannounced. The theatrical gesture reflected his personality. Everything at San Simeon was performance. The refectory served as the main dining hall. The room stretched 90 feet long and accommodated a table that could seat 40 guests. The walls were lined with choir stalls from a 16th century Spanish monastery. The stalls had been carved for monks to sit during religious services. Now they provided seating for Hollywood celebrities eating hamburgers. Silk banners hung from the refectory ceiling, creating color and visual interest in the vertical space. The banners were antique Sienese parade flags, centuries old, used originally in Italian religious processions. Hearst displayed them horizontally rather than vertically, creating a canopy effect overhead. The billiard room provided recreation space adjacent to the refectory. The room housed 2 full-size billiard tables and was decorated with Gothic tapestries depicting hunting scenes. The ceiling was another imported treasure, this one from a Spanish palace. Hearst had acquired it, dismantled it, and rebuilt it at San Simeon. The Gothic suite on the 3rd floor was Hearst's private domain. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a sitting room, and a library. The suite was decorated in heavy Gothic style with dark wood paneling, medieval furniture, and religious art. The atmosphere was somber compared to the lighter, more colorful public rooms below. His library in the Gothic suite contained books he actually read, unlike the larger library downstairs, which was primarily decorative. Hearst read voraciously, consuming newspapers, magazines, and books daily. His tastes ranged from detective novels to political biographies. The library was where he retreated when he wanted privacy from guests. Marion's suite was separate from Hearst's, following the convention of wealthy couples maintaining individual bedrooms. Her rooms were decorated in lighter colors with French furniture and a more feminine aesthetic than his Gothic severity. Marian's bathroom featured gold fixtures and marble surfaces. Her closets were enormous, necessary to house the wardrobe that Hearst provided for her. The Doge's suite was reserved for the most important guests. The sitting room featured walls covered in velvet fabric and an 18th-century painted ceiling originally from an Italian palazzo. The marble balcony included an elaborate loggia with carved columns. The bedroom was equally luxurious, with antique furniture and silk wall coverings. Every guest bedroom had a private bathroom, unusual for the 1920s, when even wealthy homes often had shared facilities. The bathrooms varied from simple to spectacular. Some featured plain white fixtures. Others had elaborate tile work, marble surfaces, and gold-plated hardware. The morning room on the first floor served as a casual gathering space. Smaller than the assembly room, this space had better natural light and views toward the Pacific. Marian used this room frequently during daytime when the formal spaces felt too grand for small groups. The theater in Casa Grande's basement was more sophisticated than many commercial cinemas. 50 plush seats arranged in rows, state-of-the-art projection equipment, acoustics designed specifically for film sound. Hearst received movies before general release, so the theater showed films that could not be seen elsewhere. The kitchen was also in the basement, along with storage rooms, wine cellars, and mechanical systems. The kitchen was industrial in scale, designed to prepare meals for dozens of people simultaneously. Multiple ovens, preparation areas, and refrigeration units. A staff of cooks and kitchen workers operated the facility like a restaurant rather than a home kitchen. Wine cellars extended through multiple basement rooms. Hearst maintained an enormous wine collection despite prohibition making alcohol illegal. The law did not apply to him in his own castle. He stored thousands of bottles in temperature-controlled cellars behind locked doors. Throughout Casa Grande and the guest houses, art-covered walls and filled niches, paintings, sculptures, antique furniture. The collection was vast enough to stock multiple museums. Some pieces were masterworks, others were simply old and expensive. His collecting had become pathological by the 1920s. He acquired art faster than it could be installed. Warehouses in New York and San Francisco overflowed with crates that had been shipped from abroad but never unpacked. He bought entire rooms from demolished buildings, storing them until space became available at San Simeon. The hoarding extended beyond art, books he never read, furniture he never used, architectural elements from raised structures. His agents scoured the continent buying anything he expressed interest in. The buying was compulsive, driven by fixation rather than curatorial judgment. Julia Morgan tried to impose order on the chaos. She created storage systems and cataloged what existed, but he kept acquiring, and the volume overwhelmed any organizational system. The castle became simultaneously a residence, a museum, and a warehouse for objects that might someday find purpose. The 165 rooms contained centuries of history transplanted to California. Ceilings from Italian palaces, fireplaces from French chateaux, choir stalls from Spanish monasteries, tapestries from Flemish workshops. Every room told multiple stories, layers of history accumulated through relentless collecting. The effect was overwhelming, beautiful but cluttered, impressive but exhausting. Guests who visited once were amazed. Guests who returned multiple times sometimes felt suffocated by the density of objects competing for attention. Hearst had succeeded in creating something unprecedented, a castle filled with treasures from across the Atlantic, located on a California hilltop, functioning as a residence and party venue. But success came at a cost that was becoming clear by the late 1930s. The castle consumed resources faster than he could generate them. Maintenance required enormous staff. The art collection needed security and conservation. The buildings demanded constant repair. He had built his dream, but dreams once realized require feeding. And the appetite of 165 rooms filled with priceless art was insatiable. 1937. The money runs out. The Great Depression began with the stock market crash in October 1929. William Randolph Hearst was 66 years old. He had survived financial panics before. The crash of 1893, the downturn of 1907. His newspapers had weathered every economic storm. He assumed they would survive this one. He was wrong. What followed the 1929 crash was different. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment reached 25%. Newspaper circulation declined as readers who could barely afford food stopped buying papers. Advertising revenue evaporated as businesses cut spending. The media industry, which had made Hearst wealthy, was in crisis. His response was to continue spending as if nothing had changed. Construction at San Simeon proceeded through the early 1930s. The parties continued. The art acquisitions continued. He had accumulated wealth for decades. Surely it would last through temporary economic difficulties. By the mid-1930s, the situation was becoming dire. His newspaper empire was losing money. His magazines were struggling. Cosmopolitan Pictures, his film company, had never been profitable and was draining resources. The various properties he owned across America required maintenance he could barely afford. He had borrowed heavily to finance expansion during the 1920s. When hard times hit, creditors wanted payment. He could not generate enough cash flow from his businesses to cover obligations and maintain his lifestyle simultaneously. He needed to choose between his empire and his extravagance. He tried to keep both. By 1937, his liabilities exceeded $95 million. In today's terms, over $1.5 billion. The number was staggering. He had gone from being one of America's wealthiest men to being one of its most heavily indebted. Creditors forced him into a financial reorganization. A conservation committee was established to manage his assets and obligations. The panel was led by John Francis Nayland, a lawyer and Hearst executive. This group had authority to make decisions about his business and personal spending. William Randolph Hearst, who had controlled newspapers and influenced presidents, was put under financial supervision like an irresponsible child. The panel immediately began liquidating assets. He owned real estate across America, mansions in New York, Los Angeles, and other cities. These properties were put on the market. St. Donat's Castle in Wales, a medieval fortress he had acquired and renovated, was offered for sale. Land holdings were parceled and disposed of. The art collection faced liquidation. He had accumulated one of the largest private collections in the world. The conservation panel forced sales. Auction houses handled the transactions. Museums acquired pieces at Depression prices, paying cents on the dollar compared to what he had spent obtaining them. John D. Rockefeller Jr. acquired $100,000 worth of antique silver for colonial Williamsburg. Other collectors and institutions bought paintings, sculptures, furniture, and decorative objects. The auctions continued through 1938 and 1939. Treasures that had been assembled over decades were dispersed. The emotional impact was devastating. He had defined himself through accumulation. Acquiring art gave him pleasure and purpose. Being forced to part with collections felt like dismemberment. Each auction lot represented not just financial loss, but personal diminishment. Construction at San Simeon stopped. In 1937, he sent Julia Morgan a telegram. "Stop all work entirely San Simeon." The words were brief and final. 28 years of collaboration ended with a telegram. Morgan closed her San Simeon office and returned to San Francisco. The castle would remain unfinished. His annual salary was cut to $500,000. For most people, this would be generous. For someone accustomed to spending millions annually, it was humiliating. He had to pay rent to the conservation panel for living at San Simeon, his own castle on his own land, and he was a tenant. Marion Davies saved him financially. Marion had accumulated substantial wealth during her film career. He had paid her enormous salaries, and she had saved and invested wisely. In 1937, when his situation was most desperate, Marion loaned him $1 million from her personal savings. The loan kept him solvent during the worst period. It also demonstrated Marion's loyalty. She gave him money knowing she might never be repaid. She helped despite his inability to marry her, and despite the drinking problem that was worsening partly because of stress over his financial collapse. Marion's stepbrother, James Cromwell, had married Doris Duke in 1935. Doris was the tobacco heiress, called the richest girl in the world. James and Marion both supported Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Hearst despised Roosevelt and blamed New Deal policies for his business problems. The political divide within the family created tension. He told James, "It's a good thing you married the richest girl in the world, because you will get very little from me. I made my fortune, and I am going to squander it myself, not your friend Roosevelt." The word squander was revealing. He understood he had wasted his wealth. The castle, the collection, the parties, the lifestyle. He had spent decades accumulating money and spent it all on objects and experiences that generated no return. He had squandered his fortune deliberately, and now he was paying the price. The late 1930s were brutal. His empire was being dismantled. His treasures were being auctioned. His castle was unfinished and would remain unfinished. His reputation was damaged by the financial scandals, and worse was coming. In 1940, Orson Welles began filming Citizen Kane. The movie would be released in 1941. It would tell the story of a newspaper tycoon whose life paralleled his own in obvious ways. And it would portray Marion Davies as a talentless social climber, destroying her reputation and casting a shadow over everything they had built together. But that catastrophe was still ahead. In 1937, he faced the immediate reality of financial ruin. The man who had seemed invulnerable was broken. The empire he had built over 40 years was collapsing. The dream he had constructed on a California hilltop was consuming itself. He was 74 years old. He had spent his entire adult life pursuing wealth, power, and permanence. He had achieved all three temporarily, and he had lost them through inability to recognize when enough was enough. The castle stood on Camp Hill, unfinished. The rooms were filled with art that would soon be auctioned. The pools sparkled in California sunlight. The zoo animals roamed the hillsides. Everything looked permanent. None of it was. Citizen Kane, the film that destroyed Marion. In June 1940, Orson Welles began filming Citizen Kane at RKO Studios in Hollywood. Welles was 25 years old, a radio star being given extraordinary creative control for his first film. The movie would tell the story of Charles Foster Kane, a newspaper magnate who builds an empire and loses everything that matters. The resemblance to William Randolph Hearst was deliberate. Writer Herman Mankiewicz, who co-wrote the screenplay with Welles, knew the Hearst world intimately. Mankiewicz had been a guest at San Simeon. He had observed Hearst and Marion. He had seen the castle and understood the dynamics of their relationship. Citizen Kane borrowed elements from Hearst's life liberally. Kane inherits a newspaper and builds a publishing empire. He enters politics and fails. He builds a massive estate called Xanadu, clearly modeled on San Simeon. He lives with a woman he cannot marry because his wife refuses divorce. But the film did more than borrow biographical details. It interpreted those details cruelly. Charles Foster Kane is portrayed as a megalomaniac who accumulates possessions compulsively but cannot form genuine human connections. His castle is a mausoleum filled with objects he never unpacks. His life is a monument to emptiness, despite all his wealth and power. The character most damaged by Citizen Kane was Susan Alexander Kane, Charles Foster Kane's second wife. Susan is portrayed as an untalented singer whom Kane forces into an opera career she lacks the ability to sustain. She fails publicly and humiliatingly. She drinks heavily. She becomes bitter and resentful. The marriage is loveless, sustained only by Kane's ego and Susan's dependence. Susan Alexander Kane was clearly based on Marion Davies. The parallels were obvious to anyone who knew Hearst and Marion. Marion was an actress. Susan was a singer. But both were women whose careers were manufactured by powerful men. Both lived in castles with their benefactors. Both struggled with alcohol. The connection was unmistakable. The portrayal was also completely unfair to Marion. Marion Davies was genuinely talented, particularly in comedic roles. Her career suffered not from lack of ability, but from Hearst's insistence on controlling her image. She was successful at the box office in the 1920s. She was respected by colleagues in Hollywood who worked with her. Susan Alexander Cain has no talent. She is portrayed as delusional about her abilities and humiliated when forced to perform publicly. The character is pathetic and somewhat contemptible. Audiences watching Citizen Kane assumed this was what Marion Davies was actually like. Hearst learned about the film during production. He attempted to stop its release. Hearst newspapers refused to run advertisements for Citizen Kane or review it. Hearst threatened RKO with lawsuits. He used his political connections to pressure the studio. Nothing worked. RKO was committed to releasing Citizen Kane despite Hearst's opposition. The studio believed the film was a masterpiece that would bring prestige. The controversy only made the film more interesting to audiences and critics. Citizen Kane premiered on May 1, 1941 at the RKO Palace in New York. Critics praised it immediately. The cinematography was revolutionary. The narrative structure was innovative. The performances were excellent. The film was recognized as a landmark of American cinema. Hearst's attempts to suppress the film had failed. Worse, the controversy generated publicity that made more people want to see it. The Streisand effect, decades before the term was invented. Hearst's opposition ensured that everyone knew Citizen Kane was about him. Marion Davies claimed she never saw Citizen Kane. She said Hearst never watched it either. She told friends the movie did not bother her, that she had learned from Hearst to ignore criticism, but people who knew Marion understood she was devastated. The film destroyed Marion's reputation retrospectively. Younger audiences who had never seen her movies assumed Susan Alexander Cain was an accurate portrayal. Marion Davies became known as the untalented mistress of William Randolph Hearst, rather than as a successful actress in her own right. The damage extended to everything Marion and Hearst had built together. San Simeon, which had been seen as a glamorous party destination, now looked sinister through the lens of Citizen Kane. Xanadu in the film is a cold, loveless place where Kane hoards objects and Susan lives miserably. The association colored how people viewed the actual castle. Hearst's newspaper career was reinterpreted through Citizen Kane as well. Kane is portrayed as ruthless and manipulative, willing to start wars to sell papers. The film reinforced criticisms that had been made of Hearst for decades. Now those criticisms had cinematic form that reached millions of people. Orson Welles later expressed regret about the portrayal of Marion. In his foreword to Marion's posthumously published memoir, Welles wrote that Susan Alexander Cain bore no resemblance to the real Marion Davies. He called the association between Susan and Marion a dirty trick that he regretted. In later interviews, Welles said, "It seemed to me to be something of a dirty trick and still strikes me as something of a dirty trick, what we did to her." The apology came decades too late. The damage was permanent. Marion's film career was already effectively over by 1941. She had retired in 1937 at age 40. Hearst's financial problems had forced him to close Cosmopolitan Pictures. Marion's drinking had worsened. She had lost interest in performing. Citizen Kane came after her career had ended, but it poisoned how that career would be remembered. The relationship between Marion and Hearst survived Citizen Kane. She stayed with him through the humiliation and continued financial difficulties. They retreated from public life, spending more time at San Simeon in isolation, rather than entertaining constantly as they had during the Golden Age. But the film had accomplished something that Hearst's financial collapse had not. It made Hearst and Marion into cautionary figures. Their love story became a tale of delusion and waste. Their castle became a symbol of empty excess. Their lives became material for mockery rather than admiration. Citizen Kane was and remains a masterpiece of cinema. It deserved the critical praise it received. But its greatness came partly at Marion Davies' expense. She became collateral damage in Orson Welles and Herman Mankiewicz's artistic vision. Marion lived with that damage for the rest of her life. She could not escape the association with Susan Alexander Cain. Every mention of her name carried the implicit question, was she really that untalented? Was her career really manufactured entirely by Hearst's influence? The answers were no. But Citizen Kane ensured that the questions would be asked forever. The film gave Marion a kind of immortality. But it was immortality as a punchline rather than as an artist. The cruelest irony of all. 1947, Leaving Paradise. By the mid-1940s, William Randolph Hearst's health was declining rapidly. He was in his early 80s. His heart was weak. He suffered from various ailments that medicine of the era could not adequately treat. He needed medical care that was not available in the remote location of San Simeon. Marion Davies remained his constant companion. She was in her late 40s, still beautiful despite years of heavy drinking, still loyal despite everything that had happened. She managed Hearst's daily life as his physical condition deteriorated. He depended on her completely. In early May 1947, Hearst's doctors insisted he move to Los Angeles where hospitals and specialists were accessible. The decision was difficult. San Simeon was Hearst's home. He had spent 27 years building it. He had lived there with Marion for over 2 decades. Leaving felt like admitting defeat. On May 10, 1947, William Randolph Hearst and Marion Davies left San Simeon for the last time. They departed in a convoy of automobiles, taking personal belongings and staff. Hearst looked back at the castle as they descended the hillside. He knew he would never return. They moved into a house Hearst owned at 1011 North Beverly Drive in Beverly Hills. The house was large and comfortable, but nothing compared to San Simeon. It felt like exile. Hearst had built a castle and was ending his life in a suburban mansion. Construction at San Simeon had stopped permanently in 1937. The telegram to Julia Morgan, "Stop all work entirely," had been final. The castle remained unfinished. Rooms existed in various stages of completion. Projects planned but never started were abandoned. The dream Hearst had pursued for 28 years would never be realized. Julia Morgan had closed her architectural practice in 1950. She was 78 years old and in declining health. She had designed approximately 700 buildings during her 46-year career. Hearst Castle was the most famous but represented only one project among hundreds. Morgan retreated into retirement in San Francisco, living quietly and avoiding publicity. Hearst and Marion's life in Beverly Hills was subdued compared to the spectacle of San Simeon. They entertained occasionally, but nothing like the grand parties of the 1920s and 30s. Hearst's health limited his activities. Marion's drinking continued to be a problem. They lived together, but the vitality that had defined their relationship was fading. Hearst's 5 sons visited their father in Beverly Hills. Millicent Hearst, still legally his wife, remained in New York. She had outlasted Marion by maintaining her position as Mrs. Hearst. Marion had Hearst's love, but Millicent had his name. The arrangement that had existed for 3 decades continued until Hearst's death. In August 1951, Hearst's condition worsened. He was 88 years old. His body was failing. Marion stayed with him constantly, sleeping in a chair near his bed. She kept a 3-day vigil as he slipped in and out of consciousness. On August 14, 1951, William Randolph Hearst died at the Beverly Hills house. Marion was at his bedside. According to those present, Marion kissed Hearst just before he died. It was the last thing he experienced before losing consciousness permanently. Hearst's death created immediate problems for Marion. She was not his wife. She had no legal standing. Hearst's sons and Millicent controlled the funeral arrangements and his estate. Marion was excluded from decisions about the man she had lived with for 34 years. While Marion slept, exhausted from her vigil, Hearst's body was removed from the house. Marion woke to find Hearst gone. She was not told where or when the funeral would be. Hearst's family made clear that Marion was not welcome. The mistress could not attend the funeral alongside the widow. Marion was devastated by the exclusion. She later said, "For 32 years I had him, and they leave me with his empty room." The statement captured her situation perfectly. She had Hearst for 3 decades of his life. His family had him in death. The funeral was held in San Francisco on August 17th. Millicent Hearst attended as the grieving widow. Hearst's 5 sons buried their father in the family mausoleum at Cypress Lawn Cemetery in Colma, California. Marion watched from a distance, uninvited and unacknowledged. Hearst's will provided Marion with financial security. She inherited a trust that generated income for life, but the amount was modest compared to the wealth she had known. Hearst's estate had been mostly liquidated during the financial reorganization of the late 1930s. What remained went to his legal heirs. Marion got enough to live comfortably, but not lavishly. 11 weeks after Hearst died, Marion married for the first and only time. She wed Horace Brown, a merchant marine captain she had known casually for years. The marriage shocked people who knew her. Marion had spent 34 years wanting to marry Hearst. Why marry someone else immediately after he died? The reasons were complicated. Marion was 54 years old, alone, and dealing with alcoholism that was worsening without Hearst to moderate her behavior. She needed stability. Horace Brown provided companionship without the complications of her relationship with Hearst. The marriage was pragmatic more than romantic. The marriage lasted until Marion's death. She lived another 10 years, increasingly reclusive, drinking heavily, struggling with the aftermath of a life spent in Hearst's shadow. She died of stomach cancer on September 22, 1961, at age 64. Julia Morgan died on February 2, 1957, in San Francisco. She was 85 years old. Her death received minimal attention. A few obituaries mentioned Hearst Castle, but Morgan's contribution to American architecture was largely forgotten. The woman who had been first in so many ways died in obscurity. Marion Davies was buried in Hollywood Forever Cemetery, in a tomb shaped like a small Greek temple. Her family had her birth name, Duras, inscribed above the entrance. Not Davies, the stage name. Not Hearst, the name she wanted but could never have. Duras, the name she was born with. William Randolph Hearst left San Simeon in May 1947 and died 4 years later. He never finished the castle he had spent 28 years building. He never fulfilled the dream that began when a 10-year-old boy toured European castles with his mother. But Hearst left something that would outlast all the people who built it. The castle remained on the hilltop, unfinished but extraordinary, and its fate would be very different from what anyone in 1947 could have predicted. The castle that survived. The Hearst Corporation inherited San Simeon after William Randolph Hearst's death in 1951. The corporation faced an immediate problem. What to do with an enormous, expensive, unfinished castle that cost a fortune to maintain and served no practical business purpose? The castle required full-time staff even when unoccupied, security to prevent vandalism and theft, maintenance to prevent deterioration, groundskeeping for the extensive gardens and property. The annual cost was substantial. The castle generated no revenue. It was a liability. The corporation explored options. Selling the castle seemed logical, but who would buy it? Maintaining San Simeon required resources that few individuals or organizations possessed. Converting it to a hotel or resort would require extensive modifications and investment. Demolishing it would be expensive and generate negative publicity for the Hearst Corporation. For several years, the castle sat largely unused. The Hearst family retained the right to use the property occasionally, specified in the eventual donation agreement. Patty Hearst, William Randolph's granddaughter, later recalled hiding behind statues in the Neptune pool as a child while tour groups passed by. The family used an older Victorian house on the property for private visits, screened from tourist areas by eucalyptus groves. In 1957, the Hearst Corporation made a decision that would ensure the castle's survival. They donated the estate to the state of California. The donation included Casa Grande, the 3 guest houses, the pools, 127 acres of gardens and grounds, and much of the art collection that remained after the liquidations of the 1930s. The donation was not entirely altruistic. The corporation received significant tax benefits. They eliminated the ongoing maintenance costs. And they generated positive publicity by appearing to make a generous cultural gift to California. But regardless of motivation, The donation saved the castle. California accepted the gift and established the Hearst San Simeon State Historical Monument. The castle would be preserved and open to the public. Tours would generate revenue to offset maintenance costs. The estate that had been the most private pleasure palace in America would become one of California's most visited tourist attractions. A commemorative plaque was installed at the castle. It reads, La Cuesta Encantada, presented to the state of California in 1958 by the Hearst Corporation in memory of William Randolph. Hearst, who created this enchanted hill, and of his mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, who inspired it. The first public tours began in June 1958. Visitors paid $2 for a tour that showed them rooms William Randolph Hearst and Marion Davies had used decades earlier. The response exceeded expectations. Thousands of people wanted to see the castle. The tours became one of California's most popular attractions, almost immediately. The castle joined the National Register of Historic Places on June 22, 1972. On May 11, 1976, it was designated a National Historic Landmark. The recognitions confirmed San Simeon's significance to American architectural history. Over the following decades, California invested in preserving and restoring the castle. The Neptune Pool required complete reconstruction in 1975 due to deterioration. The Roman Pool needed extensive tile repair. The buildings required constant maintenance to prevent weather damage. The art collection needed conservation. The grounds needed year-round care. The investment was substantial, but justified by visitor revenue. By the late 20th century, approximately 1 million people toured Hearst Castle annually. The admission fees covered operational costs and funded preservation work. The castle had become financially sustainable in a way it never was during Hearst's ownership. Julia Morgan's contribution to the castle's design was largely forgotten until the 1980s. In 1988, Sarah Boutelle published the first comprehensive biography of Morgan Julia Morgan, architect. The book revealed Morgan's extensive portfolio beyond Hearst Castle and established her importance to American architecture. Recognition came slowly. In 2014, over 50 years after her death, Julia Morgan became the first woman awarded the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal, the profession's highest honor. The posthumous award acknowledged her groundbreaking career and the buildings, including Hearst Castle, that demonstrated her genius. Marion Davies's reputation also underwent reconsideration. Film historians researching her career discovered that she was far more talented than Citizen Kane suggested. Her comedic performances in films like Show People demonstrated abilities that Orson Welles' film had obscured. Marion began to be recognized as a victim of cinematic character assassination rather than as an untalented opportunist. But the rehabilitation of Marion's reputation came too late for her to benefit. She died in 1961, never knowing that history would eventually treat her more fairly. The association with Susan Alexander Kane damaged her legacy permanently, though contemporary film scholars now acknowledge the injustice. Hearst Castle today looks much as it did when Hearst left in 1947. The rooms remain unfinished. Projects that were abandoned remain abandoned. The castle is preserved as a snapshot of a moment when construction stopped and never resumed. The incompleteness is part of the story. Visitors walking through the assembly room see the same tapestries that Hollywood stars admired in the 1920s. They swim in the same Neptune pool where Cary Grant and Jean Harlow swam. They view the same collections that Hearst obsessively accumulated. The experience is time travel to an era of excess that America never quite repeated. The castle survived because it became public property. Had it remained private, maintaining it would have been financially impossible. No individual or family could afford the annual costs. The estate would have deteriorated, been subdivided, or demolished. Its survival depended on becoming something Hearst never intended, a museum open to anyone willing to pay admission. The irony is complete. Hearst built San Simeon as the ultimate private retreat, a place where he controlled everything and everyone, where his wealth and power created a world that operated according to his rules. And that world survived only by becoming public, democratic, and accessible to ordinary people. Over 70 years after Hearst's death, Hearst Castle remains one of California's most visited landmarks. The dream that a 10-year-old boy conceived in 1873 continues to fascinate millions. The castle that was never finished has become permanent in ways Hearst could not have imagined. 3 people created Hearst Castle. William Randolph Hearst provided the vision and resources. Marion Davies provided the social grace that made it a gathering place. Julia Morgan provided the architectural genius that made the vision real. All 3 are gone. But what they built together remains, transformed but enduring. 28 years of construction, $50 million spent, 165 rooms filled with centuries of European art. And William Randolph Hearst never finished his castle. Hearst built Hearst Castle to prove something, that an American whose father started with nothing could create something rivaling European aristocracy, that wealth alone could buy immortality, that dreams conceived in childhood could become reality if you had enough money and enough time. He succeeded partially. The castle is spectacular. The collections are extraordinary. The architecture is sophisticated. Hearst created something that no one else had built before or has built since. An American castle filled with European treasures, located on a California hilltop, preserved as a monument to one man's obsession. But Hearst failed in what mattered most to him. He never finished. He ran out of money before running out of ambition. He left in May 1947 knowing he would never return. The dream remained incomplete. Marion Davies sacrificed her career and reputation for Hearst. She gave him 34 years of her life. She saved him financially when his empire collapsed. She stayed with him until he died. And she was banned from his funeral by the family that never accepted her. Marion never became Mrs. Hearst. She never had the legitimacy that marriage would have provided. She lived as Hearst's companion and died knowing that history would remember her primarily as the mistress, not as the actress or the woman who loved him. Julia Morgan designed Hearst Castle and over 600 other buildings during her career. She was first in almost everything. First woman admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts. First woman licensed as an architect in California. First woman awarded the AIA Gold Medal, though posthumously and decades after her death. Morgan died largely forgotten. Her contribution to Hearst Castle was acknowledged minimally during her lifetime. She worked for 28 years on the project and received almost no public recognition. The architect who made Hearst's dream possible was invisible. Today, Hearst Castle stands on the hilltop overlooking the Pacific. 1 million people visit annually. They tour rooms where Hollywood legends partied. They swim in pools that took 12 years to perfect. They see collections that bankrupted a media empire. And they leave understanding something about ambition, excess, and the impermanence of wealth. The castle was saved by becoming public. The private paradise that Hearst built for himself and Marion survived only by belonging to everyone. The state of California maintains it. Tourists fund its preservation through admission fees. The castle that was supposed to be the ultimate expression of private wealth exists now as a public museum. 4 massive columns remain standing at White Marsh Hall in Pennsylvania, surrounded by suburban townhouses. That castle was demolished because no one would pay to save it. Hearst Castle survived because the state of California valued it enough to accept the burden of preservation. The difference between survival and destruction was donation. The Hearst Corporation gave the castle away rather than let it deteriorate or be demolished. That decision, motivated partly by tax benefits and public relations, ensured that Hearst's dream would outlast him by generations. William Randolph Hearst began building his castle in 1920 at age 56. He left it in 1947 at age 84. 28 years of construction, never finished. But finished enough to become legendary. Marion Davies lived at the castle for over 20 years, and then spent the last 14 years of her life without it. She married someone else after Hearst died, but never stopped being associated with him. Her legacy is complicated, damaged by Citizen Kane, partially rehabilitated by later scholarship. Julia Morgan designed buildings for 46 years and created approximately 700 structures. Most have been demolished or altered beyond recognition. But Hearst Castle remains largely as she designed it. Her masterpiece survived. Her reputation, finally, is being restored. 3 people. 1 castle. 28 years. The boy who toured Europe's castles at age 10 spent his life trying to recreate what he had seen. He succeeded in building something extraordinary. He failed to finish it. But what he built, with Marion and Julia, has outlasted all of them. Hearst Castle sits on the Enchanted Hill, unfinished but permanent. The sunset views are still spectacular. The Neptune pool still sparkles. The assembly room still impresses. And tourists still climb the hillside to see what one man's dream looked like when translated into stone, tile, and imported European history. The castle was supposed to be private. It became public. It was supposed to be finished. It remained incomplete. It was supposed to prove Hearst's permanence. Instead, it demonstrates that nothing is permanent except what we give away. Hearst Castle survives not because of what Hearst built, but because of what the Hearst Corporation donated. The greatest irony of all,